The rain hammered against the windshield like angry fists, each drop exploding in a symphony of frustration that matched the storm brewing inside Victoria's chest. She sat behind the wheel of her sleek silver Mercedes, designer heels pressed against the brake pedal, hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The engine had died 3 blocks from Chez Laurent, the most exclusive French restaurant in the city, leaving her stranded in the downpour with nothing but the steady tick of hazard lights and the crushing weight of another failed evening. The blind date had been a disaster from the first handshake. Richard Pemberton III had spent 45 minutes detailing his trust fund investments while simultaneously checking his Rolex and scanning the room for more interesting company. When she'd excused herself to the restroom, she'd overheard him on the phone bragging to a friend about how he was only there because his mother insisted, and that he'd wrap things up quickly since the woman was clearly beneath his social standing. Victoria had returned to the table, smiled politely, made her excuses, and walked out into the storm without looking back. Now her car refused to start, and every attempt to turn the ignition resulted in nothing but a pathetic clicking sound that echoed her own sense of defeat. Lightning illuminated the empty street, casting harsh shadows across the pavement as Victoria fumbled for her phone. Her AAA membership had expired last month, a detail she'd forgotten in the chaos of managing her late father's estate and fighting her stepmother for control of the family business. The irony wasn't lost on her that despite inheriting millions, she felt more helpless and alone than ever before. Rain drummed steadily on the roof as she scrolled through her contacts, realizing with growing panic that she had no one to call. Her assistant was off duty, her few remaining friends were either traveling or had grown distant since her father's death, and her stepmother would rather see her stranded than offer assistance. The city around her seemed to pulse with life and warmth, restaurant windows glowing with golden light, couples hurrying past under shared umbrellas. But Victoria remained isolated in her broken vehicle, watching the world continue without her. A gentle tap on the passenger window made her jump, heart hammering as she turned to see a figure standing in the rain. Through the water-streaked glass, she could make out a man in a worn leather jacket, dark hair plastered to his forehead, hands cupped around his eyes as he peered inside with genuine concern. He gestured for her to roll down the window, his expression patient and unthreatening. Victoria hesitated, every instinct screaming caution. But something in his demeanor made her crack the window just enough to hear his voice over the storm. "Engine trouble?" he asked, raising his voice above the rain, but keeping his tone gentle and respectful. "I saw your hazards and figured you might need some help." His accent carried the faint trace of somewhere rural, somewhere honest, and his eyes held a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold calculation she'd grown accustomed to in her social circle. "I'm fine, thank you," Victoria replied automatically, the polite deflection as much a part of her armor as the designer dress and expensive jewelry. But even as the words left her lips, another attempt to start the engine produced the same defeated clicking, and she felt her composure beginning to crack around the edges. The stranger stepped back slightly, giving her space while still remaining close enough to help. "Sounds like it might be the starter, or maybe a dead battery," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood engines the way others understood spreadsheets. "I've got jumper cables in my truck if you want to give it a try. Won't take more than a few minutes." Victoria found herself studying his face more carefully, noting the genuine concern in his expression, the absence of any ulterior motive or hidden agenda. After 45 minutes of enduring Richard's transparent manipulation and self-serving conversation, this stranger's simple offer of assistance felt like encountering an alien species. "You don't have to do that," she said, but her voice carried less conviction than before. The rain continued its relentless assault, and she could feel the temperature dropping as evening settled over the city. The stranger smiled, an expression so unguarded and authentic that it made something tighten in Victoria's chest. "I know I don't have to," he replied, water dripping from his hair as he spoke. "But my truck's right there, and it seems like you could use a hand. Unless you've got AAA coming or someone else on the way." The question hung in the air between them, and Victoria realized that admitting she had no one to call would reveal more vulnerability than she was comfortable sharing with the stranger. Yet something about his presence, the way he stood in the rain without complaining, the genuine concern in his voice, made her feel safer than she had in months. "I suppose I could try the jumper cables," she said finally, her voice barely audible over the storm. Relief flickered across the stranger's features, not the satisfaction of someone who'd gotten what they wanted, but the quiet pleasure of someone happy to help. "I'm Marcus, by the way," he said, extending a hand through the narrow window opening. "Marcus Thompson." Victoria shook his hand briefly, surprised by the calloused warmth of his palm. The strength in his grip that spoke of honest work rather than gym memberships and personal trainers. "Victoria," she replied, offering only her first name like a small gift. Marcus nodded as if her name alone was sufficient introduction, then jogged through the rain toward a battered pickup truck parked 2 spaces behind her Mercedes. As Victoria watched him retrieve cables from his truck bed, she found herself noticing details that would have escaped her attention in her usual social circles. The way he moved with efficient purpose, checking the cable connections before returning to her car. The careful manner in which he examined her engine, his hands steady and knowledgeable as he located the battery terminals. The patience he showed when explaining what he was doing, speaking to her as an equal rather than talking down to her because she didn't understand automotive mechanics. When he asked her to try starting the engine after connecting the cables, his voice carried encouragement rather than the condescending tone she'd grown accustomed to from men who assumed her ignorance. The engine turned over on the second try, purring to life with a satisfaction that made Victoria's shoulders drop, with relief she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Marcus disconnected the cables with the same methodical care he'd shown throughout the process, then closed her hood with a gentle thud that seemed to signal the end of her ordeal. But as he returned to her window, rainwater streaming down his jacket, Victoria found herself reluctant to simply drive away. There was something about this encounter, about Marcus's unhurried kindness, that made her want to extend the moment rather than rush back to her empty penthouse apartment. "Thank you," she said, and was surprised by the genuine gratitude in her own voice. "I really appreciate you stopping to help." Marcus shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to be both modest and completely natural. "No problem. My dad always taught me to stop for people in trouble. You never know when you might need help yourself." The simplicity of his philosophy, the absence of any expectation of reward or recognition, struck Victoria as revolutionary. In her world, every favor came with strings attached, every kindness carried a hidden price tag. Yet Marcus seemed content to simply disappear back into the night, his good deed complete. "Can I at least buy you coffee or something?" Victoria heard herself asking, the words emerging before her rational mind could intercept them. "To say thank you properly?" Marcus paused in the rain, considering her offer with the same thoughtful attention he'd given her engine trouble. "I know a place," he said finally, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Nothing fancy, but they make decent coffee and the pie's not terrible. If you don't mind getting a little wet walking from the parking lot." The suggestion of somewhere informal, somewhere without dress codes or wine lists, appealed to Victoria in a way that surprised her. After an evening of forced elegance and artificial conversation, the prospect of genuine human interaction in an unpretentious setting felt like stepping into a warm room after hours in the cold. 20 minutes later, Victoria found herself in Murphy's Diner, a time-worn establishment with cracked vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that buzzed softly overhead. The coffee arrived in thick ceramic mugs that had seen better decades, accompanied by pie that Marcus hadn't oversold, but that tasted somehow better than anything she'd eaten at Chez Laurent. The rain continued outside, streaking the windows and creating an intimate bubble around their corner booth. Victoria had removed her designer jacket, folding it carefully beside her, and found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. Marcus sat across from her, hands wrapped around his coffee mug, and listened as she found herself talking more freely than she had with anyone in recent memory. She told him about her father's recent death, about the business she was trying to run despite having no formal training and facing constant challenges from board members who viewed her as an incompetent heiress. She talked about the isolation that came with wealth, the way people either wanted something from her or resented her for having things they couldn't access. Marcus listened without interrupting, his attention complete and non-judgmental, occasionally asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested, rather than simply being polite. When she finally paused, embarrassed by how much she'd revealed to a stranger, he leaned back in the booth and studied her with those steady, honest eyes. "Sounds like you're carrying a lot," he said simply. "Must be hard doing it alone." The observation was so straightforward, so free of agenda or manipulation, that Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had acknowledged the weight she carried, the loneliness that accompanied her responsibilities. Everyone either assumed her wealth made everything easy or wanted to diminish her struggles because of her privileged position. Marcus seemed to see past the designer clothes and expensive jewelry to the human being underneath, and his recognition of her pain felt like the first honest interaction she'd had in months. "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from her own vulnerability. "What do you do when you're not rescuing stranded motorists?" Marcus smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. "I'm a mechanic," he said, without shame or apology. "Got my own shop about 10 minutes from here. Nothing glamorous, but I like fixing things, making them work better than they did before." He paused, studying his coffee as if deciding how much to reveal. "I've got a daughter, Emma. She's 7, and she's pretty much the center of my universe. Her mom died in a car accident when Emma was 3, so it's just been the two of us for a while now." The simple honesty of his revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Here was a man who had experienced real loss, who was raising a child alone while running a business, and yet he'd stopped in a storm to help a stranger without expecting anything in return. The contrast between Marcus's genuine struggles and her own manufactured social difficulties made her feel petty and self-absorbed. Yet when she voiced this feeling, Marcus shook his head firmly. "Pain is pain," he said quietly. "Doesn't matter if you're worried about paying rent or managing a fortune. Loneliness feels the same, regardless of your bank account." His words carried the weight of lived experience, the wisdom of someone who'd faced genuine hardship and emerged with his empathy intact rather than his heart hardened. 3 days passed before Victoria worked up the courage to visit Marcus's shop. She'd driven by twice without stopping, unsettled by her own nervousness and the way her heart raced at the thought of seeing him again. Thompson's Auto Repair occupied a converted warehouse in a neighborhood that her GPS had marked as distinctly working class, surrounded by other small businesses that bore the honest wear of enterprises built through sweat and determination rather than inherited wealth. The building itself showed signs of careful maintenance rather than expensive renovation, painted a practical green that had faded to something more muted, but somehow more genuine than the pristine facades she was accustomed to in her business district. Victoria parked her Mercedes between a pickup truck and a sedan that had clearly seen better days, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the obvious disparity between her vehicle and everything else in the lot. Through the open bay doors, she could see Marcus bent over the engine of an older car, his movements precise and confident, as he worked with tools that looked well used and familiar in his hands. The sight of him in his element, completely absorbed in the problem-solving process, made something warm unfurl in Victoria's chest. She'd grown up around men who commanded attention through presence and position, but Marcus commanded respect through competence and genuine expertise. "Victoria," his voice carried surprise and pleasure as he looked up from the engine, wiping his hands on a cloth before approaching her with a smile that seemed to light up the entire garage. "This is unexpected. Everything okay with your car?" She realized that he'd assumed she was there for automotive reasons, and the complete absence of presumption in his question made her appreciate him even more. He wasn't assuming she'd come to see him personally, wasn't taking their coffee conversation as license to expect anything beyond what she'd explicitly offered. "The car's fine," she said, feeling uncharacteristically uncertain about her own motivations. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by to see your shop. You talked about it the other night, and I was curious." The explanation sounded weak, even to her own ears, but Marcus accepted it with the same generous spirit he'd shown throughout their previous encounter. "Want the grand tour?" he offered, gesturing around the garage with genuine pride rather than self-consciousness about the modest scale of his operation. The tour revealed a business built on foundation of quality work and customer relationships, rather than flashy marketing or expensive equipment. Marcus introduced her to his employee, Jake, a young man who was clearly learning the trade under Marcus's patient guidance. She watched as Marcus explained a repair to an elderly customer, taking time to show her exactly what had been wrong and what he'd done to fix it, speaking in terms she could understand without talking down to her. The interaction revealed a man who treated every customer with the same respect and attention, regardless of whether they drove luxury vehicles or cars held together with determination and prayer. "Daddy!" The excited voice came from behind them, and Victoria turned to see a small figure racing through the garage toward Marcus. Emma was exactly as Victoria had imagined her from Marcus's descriptions, all flying dark hair and boundless energy, wearing jeans with dinosaur patches and sneakers that had clearly seen extensive playground duty. She launched herself at Marcus with complete confidence that he would catch her and he swept her up in an embrace that spoke of practiced affection and unwavering devotion. The sight of them together, the easy intimacy between father and daughter, made Victoria's heart clench with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Emma, I'd like you to meet my friend Victoria," Marcus said, settling his daughter on his hip with practiced ease. "Victoria, this is Emma, the boss of this whole operation." Emma studied Victoria with the frank curiosity of childhood, taking in her appearance with the same thorough attention Marcus had shown her engine. "You're very pretty," Emma announced finally, with the matter-of-fact honesty that only children could manage. "Do you like dinosaurs?" The question came with the weight of serious importance, and Victoria found herself smiling at Emma's intensity. "I do like dinosaurs," Victoria replied, surprised by how naturally the conversation flowed. "Which one is your favorite?" Emma's face lit up with delight, and she launched into an enthusiastic explanation of the superiority of Triceratops over all other dinosaur species, complete with gestures and sound effects that made Marcus laugh. Victoria listened with genuine interest, asking questions that prompted even more detailed explanations from Emma, who clearly relished having a new audience for her paleontological expertise. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Emma growing increasingly animated and Victoria finding herself charmed by the child's intelligence and enthusiasm. When Jake approached with a question about a repair estimate, Marcus reluctantly set Emma down and turned his attention to business. "Emma, why don't you show Victoria your drawing while I talk to Jake?" he suggested, and Emma immediately grabbed Victoria's hand and led her to a small corner of the garage that had been set up with a child-sized table and chairs. The area was clearly Emma's domain, decorated with her artwork and equipped with books about dinosaurs and picture books that showed evidence of frequent reading. "I drew this yesterday," Emma said, producing a piece of paper covered with colorful crayon marks that resolved into recognizable dinosaur shapes upon closer inspection. "This one is a Triceratops family, and they're having a picnic." Victoria studied the drawing with genuine attention, noting the careful details Emma had included and the obvious pride the child took in her work. "The baby Triceratops looks very happy," Victoria observed, pointing to a smaller figure positioned between two larger ones. Emma beamed at the recognition of her artistic choices. "That's because families are supposed to be happy," Emma said with the absolute certainty of childhood wisdom. "Daddy says families take care of each other and make sure everyone feels safe." The simple statement carried profound weight, and Victoria found herself thinking about her own family experiences, the absence of safety and care that had characterized her relationship with her stepmother, and the conditional love she'd felt from her father. Here was a child who'd lost her mother, but still understood family as a source of security and joy, testimony to the foundation Marcus had built for her despite his own grief and challenges. The following week brought an unexpected crisis that would test the fragile connection Victoria had begun building with Marcus and Emma. Her stepmother, Constance, had discovered Victoria's visits to the garage through the private investigator she employed to monitor Victoria's activities. The revelation came during a board meeting, delivered with poisonous precision, designed to undermine Victoria's authority and question her judgment. "I understand you've been spending time in questionable neighborhoods," Constance announced, her voice carrying across the mahogany conference table with surgical sharpness. "Fraternizing with service workers and exposing yourself to environments hardly befitting someone in your position." The attack was calculated to hit Victoria where she was most vulnerable, questioning not just her personal choices but her fitness to lead the company her father had built. Board members shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, some clearly uncomfortable with Constance's tactics, while others seemed to welcome any excuse to challenge Victoria's leadership. "My personal relationships are not board business," Victoria replied, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. But Constance had come prepared for battle, producing photographs that the private investigator had captured of Victoria at the garage, images that made her interactions with Marcus and Emma look calculated and inappropriate. When the CEO of Hartwell Industries is photographed in compromising situations with working-class men, it becomes everyone's business. Constance continued, her tone dripping with false concern. "Shareholders expect leadership that reflects the company's values and maintains appropriate professional standards." The coded language of class prejudice wrapped in corporate responsibility made Victoria's skin crawl, but she recognized the effectiveness of Constance's strategy. Several board members were nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting the kind of social snobbery that Victoria had grown up surrounded by, but never fully internalized. That evening, Victoria sat in her penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights, and wrestling with a decision that felt impossible. She could continue her friendship with Marcus and Emma and risk giving Constance additional ammunition to use against her in the ongoing battle for control of the company. Or she could distance herself from the first genuine relationship she'd formed in years, protecting her professional position at the cost of her personal happiness. The choice felt like choosing between two different versions of herself: the isolated heiress who commanded respect through fear and distance, or the woman who discovered the possibility of authentic connection through Marcus's patient kindness and Emma's unguarded affection. Her phone rang, interrupting her brooding, and Marcus's name appeared on the screen like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Hi," she answered, trying to keep the tension out of her voice, but failing completely. "Hey," Marcus replied, his tone immediately shifting to concern. "Everything okay? You sound upset." The simple question, asked without prying or demands for explanation, nearly broke Victoria's carefully maintained composure. She wanted to tell him everything, to share the burden of fighting for her father's legacy while navigating the treacherous waters of corporate politics and family betrayal. "Just work stuff," she said instead, retreating into the safest honesty of social pleasantries. But Marcus had grown skilled at reading between lines during his years of single parenthood, and he wasn't fooled by her deflection. "Want to talk about it?" he offered, his voice carrying the same patient availability he'd shown Emma when she struggled with difficult emotions. Sometimes it helps to say things out loud to someone who's not involved in the situation. The invitation was gentle but genuine, offering support without pressure, and Victoria found herself wavering between self-protection and the desperate need for someone to understand the impossible position she found herself in. "My stepmother is making things difficult at work, questioning my judgment and using my personal life against me," she said finally, the words emerging with more honesty than she'd intended. "She hired someone to take photographs of me visiting your garage, and now she's using them to suggest I'm not fit to run the company." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria held her breath, afraid that learning about the corporate intrigue surrounding their friendship would make him reconsider the complications she brought into his peaceful life. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that," he said firmly. "Using friendship as a weapon against someone is pretty low, regardless of the circumstances." His immediate support, the absence of any suggestion that she should distance herself for his protection, made Victoria's throat tighten with emotion she couldn't express. They talked for another hour, with Marcus listening to Victoria's explanations of board politics and family dynamics with the same thoughtful attention he'd shown her automotive troubles. By the time they ended the call, Victoria felt as though she'd gained an ally in her fight against Constance, someone who understood the stakes involved and supported her right to choose her own relationships regardless of social expectations. The showdown came 3 days later, in a boardroom filled with expensive suits and expensive lawyers, where Constance had assembled her allies for what she clearly intended to be Victoria's final corporate defeat. The presentation was masterfully orchestrated, complete with photographs, financial projections, and carefully worded character assassinations designed to present Victoria as unstable, immature, and unfit for leadership. Constance spoke with poisonous eloquence about fiduciary responsibility and corporate image, painting Victoria's friendship with Marcus as evidence of poor judgment that endangered shareholder value. Victoria sat quietly through the presentation, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching as board members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. When Constance finished speaking and resumed her seat with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just delivered a killing blow, the room fell into tense silence. "Thank you, Constance," Victoria said finally, rising from her chair with deliberate calm. "That was an impressive presentation, very thorough, very professional. Very much what I'd expect from someone who spent years studying how to destroy people's reputations while maintaining plausible deniability." Victoria walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor with measured precision. "Since we're discussing judgment and values," she continued, her voice carrying the authority she'd inherited from her father, but tempered with the humanity she'd learned from Marcus and Emma, "I'd like to share some observations about leadership and what it actually means to serve stakeholders' interests." She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented decades of corporate experience and accumulated wealth. 3 weeks ago, I met a man who stopped in a rainstorm to help a stranger with car trouble. He didn't know who I was, didn't expect anything in return, and spent 2 hours of his evening making sure I got home safely. The room remained silent, but Victoria could see curiosity beginning to replace resignation in some expressions. This man runs a small business, employs several people, and is raising a daughter who believes that families take care of each other and make sure everyone feels safe. When he learned that someone was using his friendship against me professionally, his first concern was whether I was okay, not whether associating with me might damage his reputation or his business. Victoria's voice remained steady, but passion began to color her words as she found her rhythm. Constance has presented you with photographs and implications designed to make you question my fitness for leadership. What those photographs actually show is someone who has finally remembered what my father taught me about business, before lawyers and accountants convinced him that profit margins mattered more than human decency. Several board members leaned forward slightly. Clearly intrigued by this unexpected direction, my father built this company on the principle that businesses exist to serve communities, not the other way around, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger as she drew on memories of conversations that had taken place before corporate politics had consumed her father's attention. He believed that true success meant creating value for everyone involved, not just extracting maximum profit for shareholders. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that principle, and this company has suffered for it. The man Constance wants you to condemn for his association with me has built something that our company has been missing for years, Victoria continued, turning back to face the board with renewed confidence. He's created a workplace where people feel valued, where quality matters more than speed, where customer relationships are built on honesty rather than marketing manipulation. His 7-year-old daughter has more integrity and emotional intelligence than some people sitting in this room. Victoria paused, allowing her words to settle in the room before delivering her conclusion. I'm not going to apologize for forming friendships with people who demonstrate the values this company was supposed to represent. I'm not going to distance myself from relationships that have reminded me what leadership actually means. And I'm certainly not going to allow fear and prejudice to dictate who I associate with or how I run my personal life. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet that had preceded Victoria's response. Board members were clearly processing what they'd heard, weighing Victoria's passionate defense against Constance's calculated attack. Finally, Richard Morrison, the longest-serving board member and someone Victoria had known since childhood, cleared his throat and spoke. Victoria makes some compelling points about the company's founding principles, he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of decades in corporate boardrooms. And I have to say, the personal nature of this attack troubles me. We're here to evaluate business decisions and leadership effectiveness, not to pass judgment on someone's choice of friends. What followed was a discussion that Victoria would later remember as the moment she truly became the leader her father had hoped she would be. Board members who had seemed ready to support Constance's motion began asking questions about company culture, employee retention, and the broader social responsibilities that came with corporate leadership. Victoria answered with a combination of practical business sense and moral clarity that demonstrated growth beyond her years and experience. When the final vote was taken, Victoria retained her position by a margin that surprised even her supporters. But more important than the numerical victory was the recognition that the company's direction had fundamentally changed. The board authorized Victoria to implement policies that prioritized employee welfare, community engagement, and ethical business practices alongside traditional profit metrics. Constance left the meeting in furious silence, her power broken and her future with the company clearly limited. That evening, Victoria drove directly from the corporate offices to Marcus's garage, still wearing her boardroom armor but feeling lighter than she had in months. She found Marcus in the bay, working late on a repair that had taken longer than expected, his concentration absolute, as he diagnosed an electrical problem that had stumped 2 other mechanics. The sight of him bent over the engine, sleeves rolled up and hands steady with competence, made Victoria smile with an affection that no longer felt dangerous or inappropriate. "How did it go?" Marcus asked, looking up from the engine as Victoria approached. His face showed genuine concern rather than polite interest, and Victoria realized that her answer mattered to him not because of what it might mean for their friendship, but because he cared about her well-being regardless of external circumstances. "I won," she said simply, then laughed at the inadequacy of that summary. "Actually, I think we all won. The company, the employees, even some of the board members who'd forgotten why they got into business in the first place." Marcus straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth before stepping closer to hear the full story. Victoria found herself describing the entire confrontation, from Constance's calculated attack to her own passionate defense of relationships based on character rather than social standing. She talked about rediscovering her father's original vision for the company and the board's surprise support for policies that prioritized human values alongside financial performance. "I told them about you," Victoria admitted, feeling suddenly vulnerable despite her professional victory. "About your kindness and integrity, and the way you've built something real with Emma. I told them that meeting you reminded me what leadership should actually look like." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of Victoria's public acknowledgement of their friendship and what it might mean for both their futures. "And they listened?" he asked finally, his voice carrying amazement that corporate executives might actually care about character and decency. Victoria nodded, still somewhat surprised herself by the afternoon's outcome. "Most of them did. I think some of them have been waiting for permission to remember that business can be about more than just maximizing profit. They seemed relieved to have a reason to choose values over pure financial calculation." "Emma's going to be so proud when she hears that her dinosaur army helped win your battle," Marcus said, his smile reaching his eyes in a way that made Victoria's heart skip unexpectedly. The reference to Emma's generous offer of protection made Victoria laugh, but it also reminded her of the deeper truth that had emerged from the day's events. She had won more than a corporate battle. She had won the right to choose her own definition of success and her own standards for measuring what mattered in life. 6 months later, the changes at Hartwell Industries had transformed the company's culture in ways that exceeded even Victoria's optimistic expectations. Employee satisfaction scores had reached record highs, turnover had dropped dramatically, and productivity had increased as workers felt valued and respected rather than simply utilized. The partnership with Marcus's Garage had expanded to include several other local businesses, creating a network of vendors who shared the company's commitment to ethical practices and community engagement. But the most significant change was evident in Victoria herself, who had discovered that authentic leadership required vulnerability rather than invulnerability, connection rather than isolation. She spent her evenings at Marcus's house more often than in her penthouse apartment, helping Emma with homework and listening to elaborate theories about dinosaur behavior. The kitchen table, where they'd first shared cookies and hot chocolate, had become a center of family life that Victoria had never experienced, but found essential to her happiness. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some shareholders remained skeptical of policies that prioritized employee welfare over pure profit maximization, and Victoria sometimes struggled with the balance between personal relationships and professional responsibilities. But on the evening when Marcus knelt in his backyard garden, Emma bouncing excitedly beside him as he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, Victoria knew that every challenge had been worth facing. The proposal came as they watched Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, her laughter mixing with the sound of evening birds and the distant hum of suburban life that had become home to Victoria in ways her penthouse never had. "I know this isn't the fancy restaurant proposal you probably imagined," Marcus said, his voice carrying the nervousness of a man who'd spent weeks planning this moment. "But this is where we've built something real together, where Emma feels safe and loved, and where you've become part of our family." The ring was simple and beautiful, chosen with the same thoughtful attention Marcus brought to everything that mattered to him. "It's perfect," Victoria whispered, tears streaming down her face as Emma shrieked with delight and launched herself into their embrace. "It's absolutely perfect." The wedding took place a year later in the same backyard, surrounded by friends who represented both worlds Victoria had learned to navigate. Board members sat beside mechanics, Emma's teachers shared tables with corporate executives, and the officiant was a pastor from the community church, where Marcus and Emma attended services every Sunday. The evening ended with Emma, now Victoria's officially adopted daughter, presenting a drawing of the three of them surrounded by dinosaurs that she explained were there for protection and celebration. Victoria framed the drawing and hung it in her office, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important business she conducted was the business of building a family based on love rather than obligation, trust rather than contract, and hope rather than fear. The rain that had brought them together had washed away more than automotive troubles. It had cleared the path toward a life that honored both success and significance, achievement and affection, proving that the best partnerships were built on foundations strong enough to weather any storm.